There's a moment that I cherish each and every week as Emily and I bring in Shabbat with our daughter. We light our Shabbat candles, and with our eyes closed, we pause for a long while. We set an intention for the coming 25 hours. We linger and we breathe, and then the blessing begins. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam. And here's the important part. After we say the blessing, we take one more deep breath, and then we open our eyes. We gaze at the candles. Our 10-month-old is equally as enthralled by the flickering lights as we are. And we understand in a place deep inside that we have entered, we've really created a new period of Kiddusha. That we've made holy, sacred, sanctified place and time. I love this Jewish ritual, and all of the others in which we take something that is mundane and we do something to make it sacred. We break a glass at a wedding, and then the two individual people who entered the chuppah minutes before, they come out one married couple. We blow the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur during Ne'ilah, and though nothing has really changed because of the blast, everything has. We've been forgiven, and we're ready to start anew. Kedusha is something that we bestow on the world. We take the whole, we take what is mundane, and through our rituals and our actions and the love and care and intention that we pour into the world, we create sanctity in the place that it once did not exist. This week, the concept of sanctity, of Kedusha, of holiness, it's been put up for debate. Its meaning has been thrust into the public square. As many of you know, on Tuesday, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that frozen in vitro embryos should be considered children under specific state law. And while the full implications of the ruling are unclear, since Tuesday, a number of Alabama clinics that provide in vitro fertilization services have suspended their treatment as they attempted to understand what civil and criminal liability they might face if they continue to handle and store these embryos. And the facts of the particular case are pretty important. 3 families sued the Center for Reproductive Medicine in Mobile, Alabama, after a terrible incident in which their fertilized embryos, which were being stored by the clinic, were removed from their storage facility by a patient who entered the IVF area, and after handling these incredibly cold embryos, dropped them onto the floor, making them no longer viable. Now, their pain is palpable. And also, the court, in determining that embryos should be considered children under the wrongful death statute, is now upending IVF in Alabama and potentially in other states across the country. The ruling has created chaos for lots of patients, like Megan Cole, a patient in an Alabama clinic with a rare blood disorder, which prevents her from safely carrying children. Or Kayla Lee of Birmingham, Alabama, who, after several miscarriages and 9 years of trying to have a child, was just days away from having a viable embryo transferred when the procedures were suddenly halted. And before I continue, I should say we know that this is an incredibly personal conversation for each of us. Many of us are parents, many are not. Some are currently trying to have children, maybe using IVF or these other assistive reproductive technologies. Many in our community have experienced miscarriage and pregnancy loss. Some of us publicly, and many of us so privately. And while the Jewish tradition celebrates the birth of children and strongly encourages Jewish communities to support children and the parents that raise them, not everyone will want to raise children, and not everyone will have the ability. And this issue of IVF, it's particularly important for the Jewish community. According to the National Council for Jewish Women, 17% of Jewish women utilize fertility treatments to get pregnant, compared to 12.5% of the general population. So in more ways than one, this case and all of these issues, they're Jewish issues. Now, despite how serious this ruling is for Alabama and for our country, despite how this conversation affects each of us so personally, and despite the ways that this ruling is following the dangerous trend that we're seeing, restricting choice after the repeal of Roe v. Wade, I'm not sure that I'd be speaking about this from the Bema today if it weren't for the concurring opinions submitted by Alabama Chief Justice Tom Parker. Justice Parker used his opinion to suggest that verses about sanctity in the Torah instruct his decision to restrict access to IVF in the way that he does. He begins his analysis by looking at the Alabama state constitution's clause about protection of life. It reads, "The state acknowledges, declares, and affirms that in the public policy of the state, it is the public policy of the state to recognize and support the sanctity of unborn life and the rights of unborn children, including the right to life." Justice Parker writes that in using the word sanctity, the framers were implying a religious quality to the obligation to protect unborn life. And then, in an attempt to understand what the religious quality of sanctity means, he turns to the Torah. He quotes from Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, a pasuk that many of us know well, that teaches that all humans are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. He goes on to analyze the verse through a number of biblical commentators. Dutch theologian Petrus van Maastricht, a favorite theologian of the ministers of the American Great Awakening. He then goes on to analyze the sixth commandment in the book of Exodus, instructing the Israelites not to commit murder. This time he elucidates the verse through the interpretation of John Calvin. And after 5 pages of biblical analysis and interpretation, to be honest, the pages are double-spaced and they're big, so they're big. But 5 pages. He concludes that when the framers used the word sanctity, they must have been using a biblical definition, a biblical interpretation, suggesting that all life and all unborn life, in its most expansive definition, has infinite worth. Its value should be held above all other considerations. Now, Justice Parker speaks for himself in his concurrence, but it's clear that his mix of Christian fundamentalism and constitutional originalism are shared by many of his colleagues and by a wider conservative legal movement. And that's a challenge for a number of reasons. First, it's telling that in Justice Parker's originalist claims, demanding that we understand the law today the way that these original framers might have understood it, that only provides space for a limited Christian interpretation of the word sanctity. And while the Alabama framers might have actually held these beliefs, what good is our law if it can't find space for non-Christian voices as well? Can any of us really have liberty if we are not present in the legal story? If we can't see ourselves in the foundational documents? And second, despite pages and pages of legal analysis, Justice Parker and his colleagues, they don't really have anything to say about how they come to conclude that in vitro embryos should fit into the definition of unborn life. And there's a danger to this interpretation, because if Alabama and other states say that in vitro embryos need to be protected indefinitely, it will make IVF services prohibitively expensive, almost impossible to perform. In other words, in an attempt to protect life, the justices will make it nearly impossible for countless couples who desperately want to start families to bring life into the world. And to be clear, this analysis does not agree with a Jewish definition of when life begins. The Talmud teaches that when a woman is found pregnant, she exists in a halachic category as mostly not pregnant for the first 40 days. Before the 40th day, the Talmud writes, it is but mere fluid. And a midrash in Tractate Sanhedrin concludes that the Yetzer Hara, the animating impulses of a human, are not given to that human until they emerge from the womb. The Jewish tradition is pretty clear that while potential life is sacred, we give different weight to life at birth than we do life at conception. Now, I don't bring these texts or any others that exist in our canon to offer legal proof that the justices are wrong, because I don't aspire for our religious texts to reign supreme in American law any more than the Christian interpretations that the Alabama court provides. But I do want to say that our society's definition of sanctity, of godliness, it has to be multivocal. Has to be. Has to have room for the 70 faces of Torah, for all of the interpretations that we hold. And we as Jews, we shouldn't have to choose between advocating for a religious view of life, being forced into a false dichotomy between Christian fundamentalism and a secularism, which we may or may not ascribe to. Society in which freedom of religion is valued is one in which religion doesn't enter, it's not a society in which religion doesn't enter the public square. It's really one where religious tradition has space, where each person's convictions can be respected. And now that's very messy work, especially when our convictions don't agree. It's work that this Christian conservative legal movement has abandoned, perhaps never really interested in doing that work in the first place. Freedom of religion has to be freedom of all religions. Most troubling to me, though, is Justice Parker's limited view of the word sanctity. His misunderstanding or his lack of creativity of the full bounds of B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. For Justice Parker, the desire to protect these in vitro embryos, regardless of if the family wants to preserve them or not, regardless of if the family wishes or no longer wishes to have children, it's going to make it harder and harder for states and communities to support families who want to bring healthy children into the world. Why is it? Why is it that so much of our justice system, too many of our legislators, don't understand that our commitment to treating each other as infinitely valuable has to continue on from birth through the entire life course? It has to include support for childhood nutrition, for education. It has to mean that we treat each other kindly and with respect. To be created B'Tselem Elohim in Jewish tradition, it doesn't only mean that we are humanity. We don't just get it by being born. It means that we act humanely, that we become partners with God in creating the just world that we all seek, us and God. We have to do the rituals. We have to light the candles, say the blessing, open our eyes, and open our eyes to this and continue and continue and continue to do that, to continue to be created in the image of God. And any legal interpretation that blocks our ability to raise our children in healthy ways and in just communities, it's only a partial understanding of what this sanctity means. It's only a partial understanding of what it means to see others B'Tselem Elohim. Sanctity of life, it doesn't just exist. It takes work for it to continue to appear in the world. Because Kedusha lives in the prayers of a couple who believes that this round of IVF may help them raise a family. It exists in the sacred work that we do to continue to maintain access to reproductive health care to save lives. When we light candles on Shabbat, we bring Kedusha into a world where it did not exist before. Holiness and sanctity, at least in part, is something that we create. Certainly it exists in all human life, but it's something that we bring into the world through the communities that we create. So here's our bracha. May we continue to bring Kedusha into this world. May we continue to light candles, to sing brachot, and then fight for a world in which each person, each family, can be fully seen through true manifestations of God's presence, that we protect the sanctity of life. Shabbat Shalom.